Latin America has only 7% of the world's population, but 36% of the homicides. Over the past 50 years, Latin America has seen phenomenal progress in many dimensions of gender equality. But I don't think that feminist activism is a massive driver of all the changes we've observed. So it's very strange, actually, that Latin America should have these relatively benign pro-gender equality attitudes, yet such a high rate of violence. Like, those two things don't fit together. Many Latin Americans, if you ask them why is there such high violence against women, I think they will always say it's because of machismo, it's because of patriarchy. It's very obvious. No one could disagree with this empirically, that there is a strong relationship between countries, over time, and within countries. The data is very strong.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Generalist Universe podcast. My name is Caio Huck Spirandelli. I'm an economist and science communicator from Brazil. And today I bring for the second time on the podcast the social scientist Dr. Alice Evans. She's a senior lecturer in the social science of development at King's College London. In our first interview, we explored gender relations around the world. In this time, we discussed violence against women in Latin America, as well as several other topics related to it. Most of the issues we discuss in this interview are connected to articles Alice has published on her Substack blog, which are all linked in the episode description. And in these articles, you also find references to all the papers and books she mentions throughout the interview. I like to mention that I run this entire science communication project on my own, from recording to editing, so any financial support through the podcast PayPal account is greatly appreciated. You can find a PayPal link for donations in the episode description or use the QR code displayed on the screen. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Well, I believe that's all for now. Enjoy my second conversation with Dr. Alice Evans. Dr. Alice Evans, once again, welcome to the podcast and thank you for accepting my invitation to be here.
It's a pleasure. It's a treat.
Nice. So you've conducted research across multiple continents on gender relations, correct?
Yes.
So when you first turned your attention to Latin American countries, what stood out to you the most? And what initial questions guided your qualitative and quantitative investigations here in Brazil and other countries in Latin America too?
That's a great question. I think that when studying gender, culture, or really any country, you want to understand the history, the political economy, and the breadth of things going on in that place. For example, if you just look narrowly at any one thing, then you're presupposing what's important. So I wanted to read lots and lots of books on Latin American history, lots of books on Latin American culture, and also quantitative representative data to try to get a sense of big trends. And then, like you say, I study this, not just the historical depth, but also comparing it to other places. So if we take a step back, we see that over the past 50 years, Latin America has seen phenomenal progress in many dimensions of gender equality. So soaring rates of female employment, soaring rates of female representation, 11 legislative assemblies now mandate gender parity. We have massive feminist activism. When I was in Mexico, they had huge marches against femicides, etc. Also have massive legal reforms, women's rights. And many Brazilians, Mexicans say, well, that's not enough. But I see it as amazing in a globally comparative perspective. So when I'm in the Middle East, North Africa, Turkey, there's very little change in female employment or representation or attitudes. Whereas if you ask any young Brazilian woman and compare her to her grandmother, there's likely to be a huge difference in what's acceptable, permissible, expected, etc. So in that respect, Latin America is unusual that it's achieved this massive cultural change without a huge amount of economic growth going alongside it. So Europe saw a huge cultural change, but it also had economic growth. So Latin America is kind of surprising in that way. Another two important aspects, I think, about Latin America is that this progress towards gender equality has been very uneven. So because of massive income inequality, even if the wealthiest upper middle class women can realize those ideals, it's much harder for the poorest women in rural areas or in the favelas to realize those ideals, right? Especially when the schools finish at 1 p.m. I mean, that's so absurdly difficult for women. So one is that there are these big differences in whether a poorer woman is able to achieve gender equality. So Latin America still has very high rates of teenage pregnancy. So if you get a child at 16, it's harder to complete your education, it's harder to pursue in college, and then you've got worse skills, then you're not able to get a decent job, then you're stuck out in the favela and the school finishes at 1 p.m. So how can you possibly get more economic independence if you're on a low-wage, precarious job in informality? So you're going to be much more dependent on men. And even if there are quotas, you'll really struggle. So I think the poorest women are especially disadvantaged in Latin America, and it's much harder for them to achieve gender equality. So that's one aspect, the inequality. And then the second aspect that makes Latin America unusual is that it accounts for 7% of the global population, but 36% of the homicides. And that very high rate of violence, which varies across different places, it's much lower in Uruguay, that I think feeds into the very high rates of femicides and women being murdered. And so that's distinctive. So even though Latin America has converged with Europe in many respects, like in terms of attitudes, employment, representation, Latin American women are still much more likely to be murdered. So that's a big difference. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to look at all these different aspects of gender relations. We need to study change over time, and we need to understand what's driving this amazing progress, this cultural change in Latin America, and also what's holding it back, and how does that vary for different women in different places.
Okay, and what exactly do you think is driving this change in terms of gender relations in Latin America over time?
Right, yeah, so that's the really tricky question. So I think this is where it's fun to be a little bit comparative, because if you just look, let's suppose you look at the data for Mexico and you see that fertility has gone down, economic growth has gone up, and female employment has gone up. So an economist studying that data in Mexico will just say women are having fewer children and they're seizing economic opportunities. And that's not wrong, but we can see the exact same trends in much of the Middle East and North Africa, women having fewer children, women finishing education, and yet female employment is stagnant. So in much of North Africa, in Egypt, it's only 16% of women are in work. In India, there are more women in men than higher education, just like Brazil, but they're not working. So what I see looking at that data from a comparative perspective is there's something more going on. And in fact, when we look at attitudinal data, we see even in the past 10 years, Brazilians, Mexicans have become much more supportive of women working. So in nationally representative surveys, Brazilians, Chileans, Colombians are more likely to say, yes, a woman should work, women have equal right to employment, but they're no longer saying that a mother should be at home with her children. So we see this big attitudinal change across a range of issues. So the question is, why has Latin America seen this big cultural liberalization such that people are becoming more supportive of female independence, no longer worrying, oh, what will people think? When I was doing my interviews in Mexico, people would be saying, oh, my mother would always warn us, be really careful. What will people say? Don't step out of line. And in Costa Rica, women were saying that, I used to self-censor because it was always drilled into me that I always had to worry about other people's social judgments. Even women who were working, if they had young children, people might question them, or people might think that politics is men's domain. So what's driving that attitudinal change? And on the one hand, there's been massive feminist activism, and I think that's very important, especially for pressurizing states to take more action on male violence against women. Especially since democratization, you've seen lots of feminist mobilization, both nationally and regionally, for gender quotas, for stronger gender quotas, for more state action against male violence. That's all hugely important. But I don't think that feminist activism is a massive driver of all the changes we've observed. Because when I speak to ordinary Brazilian women, I say, what do you think of feminism? And they might say, that's not for me. That's a bit too aggressive. Or when I speak to Mexicans, I say, what do you think of these feminist marches? They say, these people are doing graffiti on their churches. I don't like that. So even if feminists might be important for pressurizing the state to take action, I don't think that's a full explanation of all the cultural changes in people's attitudes towards women's work. What I think is more important culturally is actually television. And I think this is important in the US and Europe as well. So when we see in Brazil, for example, the Globo network, over the 1980s, I think Brazilians went from like 8% to 80% of people owning a TV. And Globo had a pretty strong monopoly over what people watch. So everyone was watching the same television shows. And these were often showing these independent women, these unmarried women, these women being confident, these women achieving security and independence by themselves, by being pretty feisty and strong. And I think that cultural TV and radio and magazines and other things can be so important in showing an alternative possibility, showing women gaining prestige and status and independence and making that glamorous and making that achievable and making it seem like that's possible for a woman like me. Now, of course, there were also many sort of, conservative shows, sort of Cinderella story, but there's really nice research by Eliana LaFerrara that shows that when people got the Globo television signal, actually divorces went up and fertility went down. And the idea being that if you see these women surviving independently outside an abusive marriage, you're more likely to say, hey, maybe I can do that myself. And the reason television is important is because if you only observe your immediate community, then you tend to, you want to fit in, you want to get status and social inclusion by following your friends and your community. But then if everyone's following each other, how do you get any change? They're just repeating that same conservatism. So you need some kind of exogenous shock, some kind of exposure to overcome that coordination problem. Because if everyone is concerned for social respect within their community, then they're just repeating what everyone else is doing. And no one wants to stick out of line because then they'll be ostracized or stigmatized. So I think that if you have more progressive, more independent media, both in terms of women's roles and in terms of sexuality, then that can encourage further cultural liberalization. So I think the telenovelas, which of course many of them were made in Brazil and then exported across Latin America. And then I think more recently, if you look at more people watching Netflix or online social media. So for example, when I was in Puebla in Mexico, I went to a women's reading group and I said, what's your favorite show? And they were telling me about shows on Netflix. So that's like importing some US content. Or for example, when I was in Costa Rica, I'd ask women, what's on your smartphone? What are you following on Instagram? And many would say, oh, I'm following more US content. So the US content, US cultural influence has been important because that's associated with prestige. But I think the homegrown telenovelas have also been super important for driving cultural liberalization.
And talking about Latin America compared to other countries,
yes.
Sometimes if you're saying in terms of gender equality, Latin America has made such progress, right? For a lot of people that live here, they don't see that way. Most of the time because they are not exposed to any comparative research or so on. Can you give us an overview of where Latin America stands in terms of global gender equality index or something related to that? And what other countries would you consider way more patriarchal that we can relate to and understand better this improvement?
So if we take Brazilian women born in the 1930s, only about 16 or 20% of them would work, right? So very low. By the time you get to women who are born in the 1980s, that is women who are now in the sort of 30s or 40s, then 60% of them were working. That's ginormous. That's a huge, huge change. Whereas in Egypt, in Turkey, it's almost been totally flat. So as I say, in Egypt, it's 16%. So Egypt now is like for women who were born in the 1930s in Brazil. In India, for example, 89% of parliamentary representatives are men. Whereas in Latin America, you've got female heads of state. In Chile, their constitutional assembly mandated gender parity so that it was 50% women. And that's the case in many, many governments. Brazil lags behind a bit there. So again, in terms of representation, most Latin American governments are now somewhere between 40% of their representatives being women. Again, Brazil is lower, like 17%. So there's been this huge change, which you just don't see in Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, right? So I totally understand that many people can be frustrated with the slow progress. And I think that is absolutely valid when we talk about violence against women. That's totally valid. There are very, very high rates of femicides. Latin America is just a global outlier on violence. And you see those horrific stories in the news, and of course that's totally accurate. But in terms of the female employment, the female representation, and just criticizing male dominance. So in many ways, if people are criticizing patriarchy, that itself is an important dimension of cultural change. So maybe for women who are born in the 1930s, they might see it as pretty normal that your husband might be abusive, rude, and even violent. They might accept that. So I do a lot of my research is like interviewing older people, then interviewing their daughters. And many people, that's just how it was. Or women being maybe a bit intimidated and nervous and frightened by their husbands even. They're saying their husbands had a temper and you just had to be quiet and follow his rule book. But those sorts of things are much, much more likely to be criticized today. People are much more likely to see that as toxic masculinity or as problematic, right? Whereas those exact same behaviors may be expected. Or let's take another example. Maybe 30 years ago in many Latin American countries, if a woman was abused out in the streets, people might say, what was she wearing and where was she going? Now, more people will say, will not blame the victim, but question the attacker and talk about male violence in the streets. So, I'm not denying that the violence exists, but I think in terms of the other aspects of gender relations and the criticism of that patriarchy has massively changed. Or like even to take, the way that the media might report violence. So, for example, how the Brazilian media might historically refer to a man killing his wife as a crime of passion. And I think if Brazilian media did that today, people would be much more critical. If a newspaper said, oh, this was a crime of passion, you'd have a huge outburst of feminists saying, no, this is totally unacceptable. You can't say that. This isn't a crime of passion. So previously, when the media was much more dominated by men, for example, they would perpetuate a patriarchal narrative that exonerated men and gave male abusers impunity. Whereas now, on social media, that just won't stand. Lots of people say, no, it's not a crime of passion. This is a violent criminal act, and they'll call it out. Again, you won't necessarily see that in the Middle East, North Africa, where in many Gulf states, it's perfectly legal to kill your wife out of honor. In Brazil, the Supreme Court ruled in 1991 that killing your wife in defense of honor was not legal. They ruled against that in 1991, but that's still on the books in parts of the Middle East.
And the possibility of this cultural change and also in media overall, does it have anything to do with democratic states in Latin America?
Well, right. So I think that's hugely important. And I think we can see that by looking at what happened both before and after the authoritarian regimes. Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Mexico as well have a strong history. Even in the late 19th century, when the anarchist periodicals were formed or the socialist periodicals were formed, you had women who were writing, who were criticizing double standards. In the 1920s, there were Argentinian women writing novels, expressing resistance. And then much of that ground to a halt under the more authoritarian regimes in the 1970s, where there were much stricter rules on censorship and there was a stronger culture of fear. So, for example, in Chile, Pinochet imposed very strict censorship of films, so they weren't allowed to show any sort of progressive content. And if everyone is frightened, not just feminists, but if everyone is frightened, and if everyone tells if parents tell your children, shh, be careful, don't express any resistance, don't express any critique, then that has a self-silencing effect. And so under any kind of dictatorship, and this applies to contemporary Russia, contemporary China, everyone just keeps their heads down because they know it's dangerous to be critical. And schools, they teach that more authoritarian system whereby these are the rules and this is what you should follow and this is what you need to study for the exam. So what's crucially happened in Latin America, both before and after the authoritarian regimes, is that culture of resistance, of people building a sort of rights-based, individualist sort of culture. And this wasn't just the sort of pro-democracy movement, but also the evangelical-based communities, whereby the evangelical communities and liberation theology were championing rights and freedoms and resistance. And then many feminists took those ideas and say, you can't have a democracy without gender equality, or talking about how military repression in the public sphere was similar to patriarchal repression in the private sphere. So many of the ideas of the resistance were also applied to gender. So that culture of resistance has been hugely important. And Latin America would not have seen all this feminist mobilization without that democracy. But I would say a little caveat. I think that the global telenovelas were very careful that they actually framed progressive, independent women in very domestic terms. So they never said, this woman getting a job and surviving by herself is a political act. It's a feminist act. They just framed it in terms of her personal success. And I think for that reason, the telenovelas could be a little bit subversive, even during the authoritarian regime. Like, they weren't portraying this as like feminist struggle or revolution. It was just a woman being triumphant and relying on herself. So feminists might criticize that. They might say, oh, you're ignoring the collective struggle. But because they took the politics out of it and just focused on people's domestic lives, it was more palatable both to the dictatorship and also to conservative Brazilian families. And I think that's a really important point, that if you make a new idea politically and culturally palatable to people, they're more likely to find it acceptable. So, for example, if you've got a conservative evangelical family in Brazil and you show them something super radical, they might turn the television off because they don't want anything. But if it's just a woman surviving by herself, relying on herself, supporting herself, getting a nice job, then the young girls in that family might think, hey, I want to be like her because she's got this nice outfit and she's doing super well and she's super cool and she's super successful. So to summarize, democracy is super, super important for a culture of resistance and feminist struggles against state, demanding state action to end impunity. But simultaneously, very carefully, global telenovelas could subtly give progressive messages about women working. And women working is only part of the struggle, women working during the dictatorship.
Okay, and in terms of also influence of culture, like secular culture, would you say that migrants coming from Europe to especially Brazil played a role into this change, cultural and political change more to the left and bringing these secular values to the culture?
Yes, I think we definitely see that. So if we look at the individual migrant histories, in the late 19th century, many poor, struggling Europeans from, say, Spain or Italy or Germany or Eastern Europe, they came desperate for a new chance of life. And many of them came inspired by the broader working class, socialist or anarchic movements in Europe at that time. So it's not about being European as if Europeans are naturally more progressive, but rather if you came from Europe at a time of resistance, if you came from Europe at a time of trade union mobilization and struggle and growing secularism, and whereby people were questioning the role of the church and instead pushing for trade unions, if you came from that period, then you'll be like, yes, let's have that here. So that's when you see many of these people from Hungary or Italy setting up these anarchic organizations, socialist, leftist trade unions. But of course, that said, many Latin American reformists were doing that even before the Europeans came. So even in the 1850s, before you had these migrants, there would be Latin American reformists thinking that the church was an obstacle to progress. The church was aligned with the colonial regimes. The church had a lot of wealth, so they wanted to reduce the power of the church. They wanted to secularize education. So definitely the European migrants in the late 19th century had a big influence. And there was already many Latin American reformers. So I would say the combination of the two. And in many ways, what I'm saying about television is similar to the migration. When technology was very weak, when cultural communications were very weak, then ideas would mostly spread through people moving. But as technology improves, those ideas can just spread through television or radio or smartphones. So ideas are super, super important. Getting new ideas, being inspired by those ideas is super, super important, especially under conditions of democracy when everyone feels they can speak freely.
So you're saying here that Latin America has made great improvement in terms of gender equality, right? But at the same time, when you look at rates of femicide, it's extremely high.
Yes.
And you call this a paradox, right? So you've been delving into this, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about this paradox.
So many Latin Americans, if you ask them why is there such high violence against women, I think they will always say it's because of machismo, it's because of patriarchy, it's because of men feeling entitled to dominance, it's men reacting aggressively to independent women, it's men being hostile, it's men thinking that women are their servants, it's men feeling that they should have sexual control over women, and so if a woman leaves, then he's reacting in backlash. It's also about women getting pregnant at a young age and then being economically dependent on a man as a provider, then feeling trapped. It's a legacy of the Catholic Church saying that women should just stay quiet and endure it all. And I think that's all true. So patriarchal beliefs and structures are definitely a major motivation. That said, if patriarchy was the biggest driver of violence, then we would expect the violence against women and the femicides to be higher in the most patriarchal countries. And they're not. Latin American attitudes have become much more gender equal and in many ways are similar to Europe. So it's very strange, actually, that Latin America should have these relatively benign pro-gender equality attitudes, yet such a high rate of violence. Like, those two things don't fit together. And so what I suggest is that the femicides aren't just the result of the attitudes, it's also about a wider culture of violence. As I was saying, Latin America has only 7% of the world's population, but 36% of the homicides. And coming from Europe, it's just the levels of violence are just off the charts. And if you have men, for example, growing up in a culture where there isn't the rule of law, where you've got to portray a macho dominance so that no one else beats you up, if you've got to act super tough so that no one picks on you, if you've got to get into a school fight and defend yourself against bullies, then people get used to solving problems in their fists. And this is going to be especially true in parts of Latin America where the state is weaker. So where the state does not have a monopoly of violence, where people do need to sort problems out between themselves through violence, then we see much higher rates of violence. So that would be in like the northeast Brazil, in the poorer peripheral communities around the cities, in the favelas, we see much higher rates of violence. So where the state is weak, violence is high. And it's in these exact same places that you see higher rates of violence against women. So in Latin American countries where you see lots of murders of men, you also see lots of murders of women. On top of that, if you consider how many murders of men there are in Latin America, and you compare that to the global average, actually there are fewer murders of women. So for every man who is murdered in Latin America, it's less likely to be associated with the murder of women. So Latin American men aren't killing more women as a ratio. No, it's just a very violent place. I think that it is really important that feminists mobilize for state action against male violence. It's really important that feminists say the government needs to enforce the law and the police need to take this seriously. So even in Brazil, there's qualitative research showing that women might report things to the police and they turn a blind eye. So if the police is structurally sexist and if the police constantly turns a blind eye to all of this, then that's a problem because the state isn't doing its job. It's really important for the whole criminal justice system, and that goes from the police to the judges to the juries to the politicians, to recognize that there is certainly a motivation of men feeling entitled to women, men, sexual control, etc. So it's super, super important that the government devotes more money, more resources and training to make sure that the state is responsive and doesn't just dismiss it as a crime of passion. So people are totally right to address that cultural issue. It's super, super important, and I would fully support every, not just feminist activism, but also television shows that portray this as totally wrong, unacceptable, and not just something that we should dismiss, right? And it's not just television, but we want churches too. We want churches to say, no, women should not suffer by themselves. Women should not think they should suffer for the sake of their children. Because the problem is, if male abusers think they can get away with it, they will continue to exercise impunity and be more violent, right? Anyone who thinks that they can get away with violence is more likely to do it. So I totally agree that there should be a cultural struggle against violence, 100%. All I'm saying is that on top of that, what we also need is a functioning state that can reduce the violence.
Okay, the overall violence.
Yes, a world with more security for men is a world with more security for women. In a world where men feel safe and men feel secure, men don't need to act tough. Men don't need to act macho. Men don't need to cultivate a reputation for dominance. On top of that, a woman can choose her partner because he's kind, because he's caring, because he's charismatic, because he's sweet and supportive. She doesn't have to do what Brazilian police officers told me, and also people who'd lived in favelas told me, choose the toughest guy who can protect her. So just reducing the general level of violence just creates a more level playing field for women who don't have a comparative advantage in violence.
And do you have examples that you can share of studies or data that reveal this correlation between rising general violence and femicide rates?
Oh yeah, so I think one of the best examples is that Colombia used to have very high violence in general. Murders, lots of murders and crime. And then the security improved and the violence has come down massively in Colombia over the past 20 years. But then what happened is that many foreign criminal groups moved to Ecuador. And then they specifically moved, because they were drug traffickers, to Ecuador's poorly monitored ports. And what do we see if we look very specifically just at those coastal cities? An increase in homicides and an increase in the murders of women. So those two things went up totally. So it's like a one-to-one reaction. If suddenly society becomes more violent, then you also see that correlation. The same happened in Mexico. Mexico has seen a rise of murders of men, and it's seen a rise in violence against women over the exact same time period. Also, if we look within Brazil, we see persistently high murders of men in the north, in the northeast, and we see in the southeast there's been a big reduction in murders of men and a big reduction in murders of women, especially in like places like Sao Paulo. So it's very obvious. No one could disagree with this empirically, that there is a strong relationship between countries, over time, and within countries. The data is very strong.
Okay, and the reason for that would be that people are just more used to using violence as a tool to solve things, and this will just overflow to domestic violence into personal relationships?
Yeah, so I think two things. So let's suppose you and I are living in a favela in Rio de Janeiro and you're growing up in school in a culture whereby that favela is run by multiple competing gangs. Then guys need to be constantly on guard. You don't know where the threat is coming from, and you don't want any other man to think that you're weak. So you constantly have to act tough. You constantly have to project your brutal dominance. And maybe you'll even get into fights in school, and you just get so used to solving problems with violence. Even when we look at surveys across Brazil, people are more likely to say that a man should beat his unfaithful wife if they also think it's right to take the law into your own hands, to solve things through vigilante violence. And then, as I say, so people just become more accepting of violence as a way of solving problems. If you don't have those norms of being more restrained, then you may just lash out. And on top of that, like I was saying, a woman might rationally choose to be with a violent guy because she thinks he's a good protector. On top of that, we also know that violence imposes massive economic costs. So as long as a favela has very high rates of violence, then we're also going to see lower rates of economic development, right? And so you'd expect to see lower rates of education. And if women aren't pursuing education, if they can't see a way up, then maybe they're going to get pregnant when they're a teenager, and then they become so much more vulnerable. So there could also be an indirect mechanism that violence just inhibits poverty reduction, educational progress, upward mobility, etc.
And can you share some examples of highly patriarchal countries with low levels of violence against women? And what can we learn from these specific cases?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think the one point of data where there's the big difference is specifically in terms of murders. Murders is where Latin America is the total outlier. There are very few countries that aren't Latin American that have such high rates of murdering women. If you look at like the top 50 countries for the rate of women being murdered, the Latin Americans are scoring like I think all the top 20 slots or something will be Latin American places. So I think that it's just a total outlier. So if you compare within India, within northern Indian states, that's where you see the highest rate of what they call parda, which is like seclusion. So the idea that a woman should be veiled and that she should stay at home. Those states, so Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Haryana, Punjab, have pretty low levels of intimate partner violence compared to the south, where women are more likely to work. And there are two possibilities. One possibility could be that if women are so subdued and so submissive, then they're just not challenging men. You know, if you're just staying inside at home cooking, maybe there is less resistance. On top of it, another legacy might be as a result of the Islamic influence. Islam prohibits alcohol, and it's actually in northern India where you see lower rates of drinking. So that could be another possible explanation. So there's some data to suggest that North Indians drink less than Southern Indians. Southern Indians drink a lot more. In Africa, you see that same correlation whereby Muslim Africans are less likely to say that they've been beaten by their husband. So we know that across countries, if your husband drinks, especially if he drinks heavily, you're like 3 or 4 times more likely to be beaten. So this, I think, is like Islam's greatest gift for women, in that it said alcohol is totally prohibited. Now, of course, some Muslims still drink in private, they still drink in secret, but typically the rates of drinking are much lower in Muslim countries, even though in many ways they would score as more patriarchal. So lower rates of female employment, lower rates of female autonomy, lower rates of female leadership. But because men aren't drinking, going out of their minds, and we know alcohol reduces your impulse control in that people do crazy things, they get stressed by something, they react aggressively. So getting alcohol out of its society is highly beneficial. For example, just to continue on that theme, in many Latin American countries, during COVID, there was a big increase in reports of domestic violence. But one country was an outlier, and that was South Africa, where they twice initiated a ban on alcohol during the time of the COVID lockdowns. And so what they found is that during that period, fewer women ended up in hospital. And was South Africa an exception in any regard? No, it's a pretty violent place. But they restricted alcohol consumption, and so it seems that unlike the rest of the world, COVID didn't increase the domestic violence. And I think that's because you just reduce the general level of violence in the society isn't the only driver of violence. Alcohol is also a big effect. So that would be another way, besides machismo, that you would massively reduce the risk of intimate partner violence in Latin America. Reduce drinking.
Is the data coming out of these patriarchal countries reliable when it comes to gender violence and domestic violence?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I mean, some of the most patriarchal countries don't collect any data at all, right? So Saudi Arabia doesn't do a survey on domestic violence. I was in Uzbekistan for a month. There is no survey. You know, the government is not collecting data on intimate partner violence. That said, many governments, as part of their statistical agencies, have made lots of efforts to try to carefully calculate or ask sensitive questions about people's levels of intimate partner violence. So instead of saying, has your partner beaten you or have you been abused, they'll say, have you ever been slapped or something like that. But even then, there can be differences in reporting. So for example, there's a study in Pakistan whereby the reporting will vary as to whether it's like after 5 p.m. and maybe other people are more likely to be in the home, or if at the time of the survey, the woman's mother-in-law was also present. So certainly, I don't think that a survey is 100% reliable. I totally agree with you. So sometimes we don't have those surveys. Sometimes the women will be frightened to report things, especially if it's like revealing family secrets. In Mexico, they say the laundry shouldn't be washed in public. So certainly you might think that in a conservative society, people will keep it quiet. So I would not trust the reporting 100%. The most reliable indicator is going to be female homicides, right? If women are being murdered, that's a pretty good objective data. Unless you've got the worst government in the world that doesn't even keep track of murders. And that, let me add to that point on statistics. So across Latin America, many feminist campaigners have campaigned for a special definition of femicides, where it's saying a woman was murdered due to gender-related reasons, like whether that's sexual control, a man feeling that his honor is being infringed or being aggressive, etc. And the problem with that kind of data is twofold. It relies on the police's subjective assessment of what caused the violence. And there are two reasons to be careful on that, is that one, where you have very weak state control, like in northeast Brazil, and you don't have that many police people on the ground and they can't do that much reporting or investigation, when the state is totally overburdened, they're not necessarily going to understand the reasons for the murder. So you can't necessarily compare the level of femicides across Brazil because the capacity in Sao Paulo is so much better than in the northeast. So that's one issue. Also, we see change over time such that, I was talking to police officers in Brazil and they were saying maybe 5 years ago, coroners didn't recognize a woman's head being shaved as indicative of gender-based violence, right? They might just, that they didn't pick up on that clue. So if you see all this heterogeneity in the police's subjective assessment of femicides, then even though you understand why people want to get that data, the actual data that you're producing isn't so reliable. So as you rightly say, we want to track whether these murders are going up or down so that we know what's working, right? We want to be able to evaluate what policies are effective, what interventions are effective, what other factors are going to make things worse. We can't do that effectively if our underlying data isn't reliable. Because otherwise you would get a really perverse and weird outcome that as the Sao Paulo police improves and becomes more gender sensitive, then the femicides could go up just because they're recognizing it as femicide. And that would be crazy because we'd be incorrectly punishing improved gender sensitivity of the police. And we don't want that. So for that reason, I totally agree with you that it's very important that we get decent, reliable data that enables us to track change over time and between places.
In terms of different demographics, especially in terms of the countries you've been to, and how women in different social classes are vulnerable to femicide, what are the things you were able to identify as patterns while talking to women and people in these countries in Latin America?
Okay, great point. So I think there, my qualitative interviews are less useful, and what's better is the statistical, nationally representative evidence. Violence can happen across cross-sections of society, whether people are rich or poor, but it's more common, as I say, in more violent communities, which are often also poorer, less educated. So, for example, Gabriela Deschamps, who's a Mexican PhD student at the London School of Economics, she found that in Mexico, a real source of vulnerability is if women have an unwanted pregnancy when they're a teenager, and then they quickly cohabit with that guy or quickly marry that guy. So like they're having children with a guy who they don't really know. Because then they haven't really screened that guy. They haven't really worked out, is this a great guy or not? So if girls are having children quickly as teenagers without really knowing the person, then they can become trapped in relationships. And I hear this so many times in my qualitative interviews in Brazil as well, whereby I've interviewed women who told me that they got pregnant when they were very young, and then that guy turned out to be abusive. And so this is a case of so many Latin American women, whereby, of course, if you're a teenager, you don't have much. As I was saying earlier, you are economically dependent, you're economically insecure, you may be fearful of your options, and so you may think, let me stay with this guy for the sake of the children. And then that gives him the impunity to be violent. Or on top of that, you just haven't been able to, you're having children without knowing what kind of guy this is. So I think teenage pregnancy really elevates this risk. And that's certainly shown by Gabriela Deschamps' data in Mexico, but also, poorer communities. And so why might poverty be associated with intimate partner violence? And I think there are several possible mechanisms. One is that you're living in a more violent community. On top of that, education itself seems to help people develop more impulse control. So when people don't have that impulse control, they're more likely to lash out in many ways. So education can improve people's impulse control. It can improve people's intelligence, right? So intelligent people, they're able to discipline their emotions. They're able to control themselves. So that's another driver. Another really important driver that has been found through many studies in the USA is lead poisoning. So lead poisoning can occur through many ways. It can be through mining, industrial pollution. It can also be through unchecked and poorly regulated infrastructure. So if there are lead pipes, for example, if there is infrastructure from the 1950s that is going really bad, right? If people are dealing with that crappy infrastructure that was set up generations ago and no one's repaired it, children who are exposed to lead pollution, it has massive cognitive impact because it affects the part of the brain that's responsible for impulse control. It affects the prefrontal cortex. So instead of exercising that executive function whereby there is some stress and I'm thinking, okay, let me process it, let me work out how to handle this. If I don't have that impulse control, then I may react aggressively. So I think there are several reasons why poverty might be associated with higher violence. One, it's less education. Two, it's more violent neighborhoods. But also it's that bad infrastructure and that lead poisoning that means that those children could actually be blighted from their childhood. And so that's why Latin America's inequality is so important, because the rich elites who are living in much more safer spaces with private security or in gated communities, or who completed university education and who have decent infrastructure without the risk of lead poisoning, those people can just be in a more safer, secure environment where people don't lash out. That's the fundamental issue. It's people lashing out. And that the precise trigger could be machismo, but the underlying problem is, why are so many Latin Americans lashing out over a problem?
Your second article is exactly trying to explain why homicides are so high in Latin America. So maybe we can go through a little bit of some of the topics you covered in this article.
So I think when studying every society, it's really important to have a historical perspective. And so a really distinguishing feature of Latin America, of course, one is recognizing the indigenous history. And of course, that had lots of violence, right? So when the conquistadors came, there were many warring groups fighting between themselves. So colonialism did not invent violence, but it certainly fueled an impunity because the white Europeans had a improved technology, and that enabled them to seize the most valuable territories, the most valuable land, and then entrench a level of impunity. So they established haciendas, they established encomiendas, they established plantations, whereby that white European elite created what Acemoglu calls extractive institutions. So they created institutions that consolidated their wealth and their political power, and then they could exercise unchecked violence. I think it's striking that in Brazil, for example, it was only in 1988 that they removed the literacy requirement for voting. So that's an example of whereby a privileged elite entrenches its own dominance. So you always had that wealth concentration in Latin America, and that accelerated over the 20th century, whereby the wealthy industrialists and the rich landowners, they were able to push and control the government to develop policies that favored their own interests, right? So I'm a rich landowner, I want all the policies to benefit me. And what that saw is a rise in inequality over the 20th century. And it also thwarted Latin America's development, because instead of having pro-labor industrialization and job-creating economic growth, in fact, the benefits were rigged towards the elites. That created a system of inequality, and those rich elites were also able to evade taxes. So Latin America today has relatively low direct taxes, that the elites don't pay so much tax. So that also reduces the state capacity. That also reduces whether you've got an effective state. Very nice paper by Soares and Naratomi. They show that if you compare Latin America to other countries, other regions, you'll find two distinguishing features of Latin America. One, the high inequality, but also relative to the level of violence, not many police, not many judges. So there's relatively weak state capacity. So as part of this inequality, if the elites aren't paying their fair share of taxes, then this means that the poorest people have a strong incentive. If you don't believe that you can get up through honest means, if you don't believe that you can get a decent job and buy a house and provide for your family, you may think, hey, there's a nice guy down the road who's owning a nice car, maybe I'll take that car for myself. And if there is no effective policing to stop you from doing so, anyone would seize that opportunity, right? So as a consequence of inequality and ineffective police, or a weak police, then that one figured. So inequality and a weak police presence, that's super important. On top of this, Soares in more recent work shows that Brazil's commodity boom, the oil boom in oil-rich regions over the 2000s, when there was an oil price boom, what that meant is it increased inequality, it increased the earnings of skilled workers, it increased the capital to the owners of capital, but it didn't do much for the poorest people. And even though the local municipal governments were collecting more taxes and were investing more in public education, public services, Soares found that it didn't lead to any improvements. So even though there was more investment in public services and public education, the rate of secondary education didn't actually improve. The rate of the police effectiveness didn't actually improve. So it seems like it's not just a function of how much the Brazilian government spends, but whether it's able to have an effective state. So it could just be that there's a lot of corruption. It could be that the government is spending a lot of money on hiring personnel, on expanding the size of the state, but not actually delivering any benefits for anyone. So those are a couple of things. But basically, if you have, a rise in inequality, but not an effective state, then there is every incentive to loot and seize all these opportunities. And so we certainly see that comparing across Latin American countries, where the state is weak, where the state is ineffective, we also see drug wars. So there's a wonderful book by Deborah Yasha, and she basically argues that a lot of the homicides in Latin America are basically rival drug gangs fighting over territory. So where you have places, for example, in northern Mexico, where you don't have a strong state presence, or in parts of the border regions in northern Brazil, where the state is weak, that's where the drug gangs go, because that's the valuable territory to traffic drugs. And then when the two sides compete, it's always the competition. The competition between criminals is what fuels the violence. And you can see that very clearly if you look at Rio de Janeiro versus Sao Paulo, right? Where you have lots of criminal gangs competing, that's where you have more violence. So that's one point. So again, is this underlying theme that you've got a weak state and you've got competition to make money. On top of that, there's a really nice paper highlighting that when the Brazilian government shifted to firing up planes after 2005, they started a process of targeting the planes traveling with drugs. Then the drug traffickers thought, okay, where is the state weaker? Let's go into the Amazon. And then what happened is the police followed them into the Amazon. But of course, communities live on the ground. And so that caused an escalation of violence. Here's a really big problem. It's like a game of whack-a-mole. Like I was saying earlier, with when they improved the state security in Colombia and it went to Ecuador. So when the Brazilian government started targeting the skies and the planes, the drug traffickers went down to the ground, and that exposed all those vulnerable communities. So that's another problem, that even if control over the terrain could improve if you've got international traffickers responding to the US and European demand for drugs, then the criminals may just jump ship. So not all of Latin American crime is due to drug trafficking. Like in El Salvador, a lot of that crime was just people, and also in parts of Colombia, crime has been protection rackets, whereby criminals say to businesses, you've got to pay up or we're going to punch, kill you. But in much of Latin America, the crime is criminal gangs trying to make a lot of money in response to Western demand for drugs. And as long as that Western demand for drugs remains high, as long as criminal gangs can make a lot of money from selling drugs, then they are like any market actor, that they rationally respond to that violence. And so if the security improves in Colombia, then the traffickers move to Ecuador. So that's another big challenge.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially in the case of El Salvador, which got very famous with Bukele as a president. But again, like when you look at the details of the criminality, or for example, the profit margin of your criminal activity, it plays a big role on how much money you have to invest in protection and changing strategies to keep your business running. So if this is not taken into account, it can lead to very simple solutions that might never work.
Yeah, so this is what I found so fascinating. So Chris Blackman, who has a wonderful book, Why We Fight, he's got a more recent paper analysing what works. And he says what's really important in analysing and responding to crime is to have a local diagnosis. So what exactly is driving the crime in Rio? What exactly is driving the crime in Medellin, for example? And he highlights that El Salvador in the early 2000s, they did this process of mass arrest and it was totally ineffective. He also highlights that even though Bukele's strategy seems to be successful for now, his 2022 crackdown, actually the homicides were declining from 2015. So they were already going down. And what he highlights is that happened then is there was this secretive truce, this pact between the criminal leaders and also the government. And maybe that also helped them having the process of mass arrest. And what's also crucial, he argues, in El Salvador is that you didn't have so many international drug traffickers, rather you had these protection rackets. So his argument is that if it was a story of drug traffickers, then once you locked up a lot of criminals, then you get replacement. But because it wasn't that sort of international demand, then you didn't have the replacement criminals. So Chris Blackman's point there is that these mass arrests aren't necessarily effective. And even though many Latin Americans who are super fed up and frustrated with the violence, actually, Chris Blackman argues that actually some of these mano dura solutions don't necessarily work. And what's really much more important is to build people's confidence in the rule of law, is to build people's belief that the state can reduce violence and that the state is going to provide checks and balances, that the state is going to provide law and order. So just having a bunch of kamikaze, crazy cops going into an area and beating everyone up and shooting, 50 guys or whatever, it doesn't necessarily make people safer. There are many instances where there's been a mano dura approach and that hasn't worked. Now, I'm not saying that as someone who instinctively recoils about police aggression. All I care about is the outcomes, right? And if the outcomes are not working, if the outcomes are not making people safer, then we want to rethink whether that's an effective intervention.
Yeah, it's complicated, especially when you already have a violent society like Brazil, and then you hear about Bukele and how successful he has been just by imprisoning or establishing like the mano duro or like iron fist state. This will definitely inspire other politicians. I think he got very famous in the US.
Yeah, totally. And there are two really important distinguishing features. So as I was saying, in El Salvador, Chris Blackman's argument is that the criminals were not responding to a popular demand. They were doing something very unpopular. They were extracting rents by creating these protection rackets. No one wants a protection racket. No business says, we really want someone to force us to pay up on threat of violence. What's different about, say, Rio de Janeiro is that the commodities boom did enable, and rising inequality means that you have a more affluent section of society that's purchasing drugs, for example, among other things. So in Rio de Janeiro, you've got this local demand for illicit goods, and then different criminal syndicates compete to supply that demand. And let's suppose you totally destroyed and decimated one criminal syndicate. Okay, great, well done. Now a new criminal syndicate will form to supply that existing demand for drugs. So that's the problem, right? So I think the argument is saying, yes, we need a strong and effective state. We need a government that can improve the rule of law. And that doesn't necessarily mean just smashing people's heads in. So, for example, another place that's seen a big improvement in safety has been San Francisco. San Francisco used to have really high levels of homicides and violence, and it's just seen its lowest level of homicides in 60 years. And part of that has just been enforcing the rule of law. Like, the police aren't going around killing people. The police are enforcing the rule of law and doing their job. Right? So it's just about having an effective state with the capacity. And I think that there is some scope for technology to improve things. So, for example, cameras can enable better tracking of criminals. But I think that Latin America now has two problems. One is that there are some areas of Latin America where the state does not control. Right? So there are some favelas or some parts of the northeast or some peripheral regions or some border zones where the state does not control those areas. Instead, you have criminal gangs. Instead, you have militias. On top of that, the big problem now in Latin America is that these criminal syndicates are increasingly entering and intimidating judges, juries, and politicians. And that politicians may now be governing in coalition with criminals. So instead of seeing it as a situation like the state versus the criminal, what's now the case is sometimes the state might turn a blind eye because it's on board with the criminals. And that's a dangerous situation.
Yeah, it gets very complex once you have the criminal organizations into the bloodstream of society as a whole, which is the case of Brazil.
And that's what we'd expect. As criminal syndicates make more money, they'd be able to have more influence, they'd be more able to enter politics. So that makes it very, very dangerous, because then maybe the police could turn a blind eye against one syndicate. You know, let's suppose that one set of people and they're like, okay, we're going to protect the Red Command. We're going to let them do really well. And then you can just get a vicious cycle. And I think what I find concerning is that there haven't been so many cases in Latin America where the violence has reduced just because the state has suddenly... It's hard for the state to become more effective in ensuring the rule of law, as in preventing violence from all parties, if you get one violent group entering politics and becoming dominant. It's very difficult to get out of that situation.
Yeah, and it's the case of Brazil right now, I believe. And it's, again, right, we need an evidence-based approach to the problems, and this will also demand a very stable state and very efficient state, which we don't have to begin with. So it's a very difficult...
And I would add, and this may surprise you, I would add pensions. So a big problem in Latin America at the moment is that fertility is collapsing. So fertility is getting very low. And what this means is that Latin America's population is going to become older. And older people are less economically active, they're less productive, so they're not contributing to tax revenue. But if the government has less money, how can it possibly provide an effective police service? So this is something I'm really worried about, right? So as Latin America gets older, where will the money come from to provide all the policing? That's going to be a big challenge.
Which is something that you've been
exactly. Yeah,
right?
My next trip, I was in Costa Rica. I was giving a talk on fertility. I'm going to Santiago. I'm giving a talk on fertility there. In many parts of Latin America, the fertility is now lower than the US. The fertility rate in, some parts of Latin America is like 1.1. In the US, it's 1.6. Like, that's never happened before. Previously, it was Latin Americans having big families. Now, the US has bigger families. It's wild.
Yes, and what is driving, well, we have time, so what is driving this fertility, this drop in the fertility rate?
I think if you talk to many people, they'll say, oh, it's the economy is super tough, or housing is expensive, or children are expensive. And I think that could certainly be part of the story, that it's tough to have a kid, it's expensive. But I think that won't explain why it's suddenly happening right now, that there's been this very rapid drop in fertility. And one thing it's closely correlated with is the rise of singles. So more Latin Americans, and in fact more people right across the world, in Europe and the US too, are staying single. So Latin America, the rates of cohabiting are down, especially among young people. And this is happening very recently. And I think one thing that it coincides with is the massive boom in smartphones. So now we have these exciting devices which, give us all these fun things that, I can play, all these exciting games or videos or sports bets, sports gambling or social media on my phone, that this is so stimulating. So I have research from GWI, which is a consumer survey company. It's like Brazilians spend 3.5 hours a day on average just on their smartphones. And so what's happening, I think, is that one, this technology is becoming cheaper, so everyone owns a smartphone. On top of that, each of these different apps, each of these technology companies is competing with their competitors to provide a more engaging product. And as these products become more engaging, more exciting, they keep us hooked. Oh, look at it. I've got all these exciting, I've got, just during this podcast, I've got 2 missed call. I've got an alert from, I've got an alert now because I'm such a loser. It's an alert from the Financial Times, right? But anyway, I've got an alert. I've got another message. I've got another notification. Every single company is sending me all these notifications of all these exciting things because they're trying to grab my attention. And as people become so hooked by these little hooks of dopamine, come and play with us. It's like the sirens. It's saying, come and play with us. Come and play with us. And so we spend more, for example, a massive issue in Brazil is like sports bets, sports gambling. Each of these companies is really trying to hog users' attention. They want users' money. They want users' attention. They want users' time. And this technology is becoming so hyper engaging that it often seems to displace personal connection. So let's suppose on my street there are a bunch of people, but they're not that exciting. Now, maybe 20 years ago when I had nothing better to do, I might go and hang out with my neighbor and chat to my neighbor. But now, why would I bother talking to my boring neighbor Maria when I can watch Netflix or when I can play Call of Duty or World of Warcraft? They are much more fun than Maria. But the problem is if I'm spending all my time playing Call of Duty or sports bets, then I don't necessarily become more interesting, charismatic. If I'm spending all my day just doing this, scrolling, I'm not becoming a fun, charismatic, jokey, fun person. Moreover, I might actually be a bit nervous. So maybe when Maria invites me to go to a bar or to go and hang out or to go to a party or a carnival, whatever, I'm actually a bit nervous about meeting all those people because I'm not used to meeting people. So I think that's the big danger, that people get hooked on this hyper-engaging media, they socialize less. And if you're socializing less in general, then maybe you don't have the confidence, the skills. So even if you meet someone on a dating app, maybe that date is going to go badly because both of you are not that fun, right? Ultimately, if people are going to form relationships, they both need to have a fun date. But if you spend all your day just like this, you're not going to be a fun date. You may not even want to. So there was a survey in the US whereby they found that over 55% of young Americans are single. On top of that, half of them aren't even bothered. They're like, I'm fine. If you've got Call of Duty and you can work from home and you've got all the entertainment you need, you're like, why bother? Even today, we see a rise of these companion apps whereby people are seeking AI girlfriends, AI boyfriends. And if you can have a boyfriend who's like, oh, Alice, you're so hilarious. You're so funny. You're so insightful. Wow. Oh, Alice, how was your day? Tell me all about your difficult day. Oh, Alice, you are just killing it with these jokes, right? Wow, what a guy. He's so nice. He's so friendly. He thinks I'm fantastic. And especially if I'm scared of meeting real people and my personality is itself pretty crappy, as you can see, right? I just stay with my AI boyfriend. So I think that's a big problem. And it's something I'm actually concerned about because Ironically, in a free market, the technology companies have all the freedom and all the market incentive to improve and to improve. And meanwhile, humans aren't improving. In fact, we may actually be deteriorating because we're not practicing all these social skills. Social skills are something like maths. You need to practice in order to become better at maths. You need to do jujitsu to get that black belt.
And why exactly you're focusing here on smartphones? Why not other variables like, for example, feminism,
great
the
question.
relationship between feminism and low fertility rate, or
I would say two things. So that's a great question. So I think one, that this change, this sudden drop in fertility has occurred alongside a sudden drop in coupling. So that correlation is strong. Okay, so could it be something else that's causing the rise in singles? I think that's perfectly possible. So certainly in the US, Europe, Latin America, places are becoming more culturally liberal, right? So maybe 50 years ago, it was the done thing. It was important for social respectability that you marry and you had children. It was so normal, so expected, you wouldn't even question it. But as society becomes freer, more independent, maybe a guy can say, hey, I don't actually want the responsibility of a wife and 2 kids. That's a lot. Like, the economy is pretty crappy. I don't have a decent job. I don't even have a formal job. I'm in the informal economy. I've just got this little stall. It's all pretty crappy. I don't want the responsibility. And no one's judging me. No one's shaming me. No one's ostracizing me. No one's saying, Petra, you're a bad man, or you're a loser, or you're a weirdo. They're just letting me do my own business. So that I totally get that. I totally see that. Cultural changes could reduce the stigma. In fact, the globally most streamed song in 2023 was Miley Cyrus' I Can Buy Myself Flowers. So she is celebrating female independence. So I totally see that cultural change. That said, we see the same drop in fertility in very different societies. So even in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Turkey, in all these places which are very religiously conservative, which have very low rates of female employment, fertility is dropping. So it's not like Egypt is having a feminist revolution. Their female employment is 16%. Yet everywhere is seeing the rise of singles, the rise of people spending time on their phones, and the drop in fertility. It all fits together. So if we look around, what's happening globally all at once is this big hit of smartphones. So I'm not denying other possible factors. So, there's also going to be a role of cultural liberalization. There's also going to be a role by the fact that more Latin Americans can now access contraceptives. There's also going to be a role for education and women increasingly seeking to have more control, etc. So I don't say it's just one thing, but that's certainly a big part of it.
So yeah, we covered a lot, but every topic we touched here, they're interconnected, right?
Yes.
Because we started talking about gender violence in Latin America, which then led to your research on highlighting the importance of violence, overall violence in femicide rates. And then why do we have such high rates of homicide overall in Latin America, which led us to explore the economy and the history of the country and the importance of the state, which led us to talk about how criminal activities is getting into the state itself in Latin America, and then how difficult it is to have a strong state when the economy is not doing so well, which will be even harder with a low fertility rate. Would that be a good summary?
Yeah, exactly. And so you see that Latin America is just this very unusual case whereby culturally the support for gender equality has increased, but the reality, especially for the poorest women, may be these consistently high femicides. For example, if you ask me to predict what I think will happen in 20 or 30 years' time, my worry would be that if criminal gangs become more politically powerful and the state does not become more effective and the state does not have more money because of falling fertility, then we will continue to see that very high violence in general, and that lack of security for men will also mean a continuation of a lack of security for women and those very high femicides, especially among the poorest, more violent communities. The only thing that may change this is that because the North America and Europe see falling fertility, they will become increasingly likely to want Latin American migrants, right?
But then it's even a bigger problem for Latin America itself.
Yeah. So that's a contested area. But yeah, so the women who do manage to go to the US, that's an option for them because at least you're moving to a safer neighborhood. But again, that's going to be mediated by class. That the women who are growing up in the poorest favelas will be the least able to move. So, all these things are super, super tough. But overwhelmingly, I just think the most important thing, the thing that would change women's lives the most in Latin America is just effective states and general security. But Latin America should simultaneously be congratulated and recognize how much they've achieved. And I think it's important to recognize that progress because that pushes us to ask the questions about what's caused that progress. Like, I think a part of that story is the telenovelas. And it would be cool for people to use big data and large language models to study that.
Okay, and one last question, Alice. I'd like to hear from you. What is the importance of qualitative research that you do? And why is it so important for you and for your research to go around different countries and stay for a while, talk to people? How important that is?
Oh, yes. Qualitative research is a cornerstone of what I do because it helps me understand what matters to people. It helps me understand, what are their desires? What do people want? What do people think is ideal? How do people spend their time? Let me give you an example, just very trivial. That when I was in Uzbekistan, I knew that people were spending their leisure time hanging out with their families. And if you only did qualitative research in Uzbekistan, you might consider that totally normal, right? You hang out with your families. But if you take this more comparative perspective, you'll see that actually that's pretty unusual in a global perspective. So in Europe, people or Latin America, people will be more likely to hang out with their friends. So just me spending time with the Uzbeks, seeing that they're spending time with their families, I realize the importance of strong family ties. I realize how important it is to be loyal to your family. I also saw this in Morocco. For example, once I was there during Ramadan and I visited 6 different cities and I was staying with this one family and her mother was preparing the iftar, that is the meal where you break your fast. And the mother wanted dates. So we had to walk all the way across the Medina, that is the market, to find dates from one specific person. And as we were walking through the market, I saw so many different dates. I was like, why? What's wrong with those dates? Like, all dates look the same to me. What's wrong with these dates? Like, all the same. And she said, no, we have to buy from our cousin because we trust our cousin. And I think that's such a good example of how in the Middle East and North Africa, there's very high rates of cousin marriage, very strong family ties, very strong family loyalty, very strong trust in kin. And so people tend to socialize and do business and even marry among their relatives. So that's given me a strong signal about how important family ties are and family loyalty is. So me walking 2 miles in the hot sun across Fez to get dates, that was useful for me. That was really useful because it helps me understand what's important to people. Or for example, going back to our case of Latin America, you can ask Latin Americans, what do you think of feminism? And if ordinary men and women, non-feminists, non-activists say to me, I'm not so keen on it, or they're a bit aggressive, or I don't see the point of all this marching, or I've never been in a march, that helps me understand that maybe the feminist activism isn't the key driver of some of these cultural changes. Or I can spend time with people and ask them, how do you like to spend your leisure time? And if people say, I really enjoy these telenovelas, and I ask them, which characters did you like and who do you enjoy watching? That helps me understand what actually matters to people. There are so many different aspects to it. So one is doing that comparison. One thing I found funny when I was in Brazil, a year ago, I was in Hong Kong. I was staying at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And my windows were barred. And I couldn't open my windows. I couldn't even get out of my windows. And that's because China and East Asia more generally have such a competitive society whereby people really want to be number one. They try so hard in school and work. They work very long hours. Sometimes even in schools, the seats are allocated according to your ranking. That when people don't achieve number one, when people aren't thriving and being at the top, they can feel very depressed and they feel like they're a failure. And so for that reason, South Korea and Hong Kong have high rates of depression, high rates of suicides. So these bars were put up because someone the year before in this postgraduate accommodation had thrown themselves out of the window, right? High rates of suicide. Whereas when I was in Brazil, the bars were outside the window because of the high rates of violence, right? You don't want someone to come in. So I just think these little things that you can see they reflect something bigger about the society. And so, this is a society where people are nervous about outsiders. There's a threat of violence. There's a danger of violence. So you pick up on these little things. You work out how things are different. Let me give you another example. When I was in Hong Kong, it was for the Lunar New Year festival, which is like the Chinese big celebration, the annual celebration New Year. And when I went to the big market, all the items, all the toys, all the banners, all the slogans were all celebrating luck and money. There was a cat, everything was all about luck and money. It was like, make money, get rich. Even when I went into the Hong Kong supermarkets, there was a freezer where the supermarket freezer was saying, hope you get rich this year. Everything was about luck and money. And this tells me something about how important this ideal of economic prosperity and upward mobility is in Cantonese and Chinese culture more broadly. So it's just like going to a supermarket can teach me a lot about the culture. Or, for example, when I was in Sardinia in Italy, I'd go to churches and I would discover, these churches are pretty empty. And that would make me see that actually there's been cultural change and people are less religious. So it's all these little things that I do, whether it's talking to people about TV shows or going to supermarkets, helps me sort of work out, okay, so this is what's important here. Another thing I love doing is interviewing like grandmothers and their daughters, because then I can really see the generational differences. But the most important thing is that it's not me doing that by myself. There are so many people all over the world who have said, Alice, come and stay with us. We're going to help you. We're going to connect you to people. And so those amazingly generous, kind people enable me to understand each society and work out what's going on. So yes, this is very much like this hugely collective effort about, kindness and generosity where people really try to help me. So it's not Alice Evans doing any of this by myself. There are so many very nice people helping me work it all out and like build a big jigsaw.
Nice. Okay, Alice. Well, I think we covered a lot here, and I want to thank you once again for coming on the show.
No, thank you so much. Thank you.